Good evening. Matt wants me to teach on 2 people, so I'm going to teach on 4. In a way I am, but mostly 2. Open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 3. We're going to be looking at 2 husbands and 2 wives. And before we jump in here, I'm going to borrow your brains and ask, what are some excuses for sins in our life? Just any excuse. I'll throw one out there. I didn't know that it was a sin would be an idea of an excuse. What would be some other excuses we might come up with when we find out that we have sinned or we're in sin? God will forgive me. Okay? It's not that bad. Both people said it at the same time. Everybody else is doing this.
Or this particular person that I know is godly does this.
This other person I respect's doing it. Can it really be that bad? I only did it once. This one's...
This will be my last time doing it.
This will be... I could quit anytime. This is my last time doing it. I couldn't help myself. That's a really good one. We're actually going to touch on that for sure. Most of these we're going to touch on these. Nobody knows about it. That's a really good one. It's a gray area. Lord's not coming back tonight. Very brazen. No one told me. Okay. I think we could come up with a lot more excuses. But let's look in Genesis chapter 3. I'm just going to begin reading. Now, first, before we begin in chapter 3, what were the commands that we know God has given man at this point in Genesis chapter 3? Don't eat of the tree. What other commands did they have? Be fruitful and multiply, and one more. Tend to the garden. Okay, we've got 3 commands for Adam and Eve at this point. Now, the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? Now he's asking a question. I have a feeling Eve knows the answer. And it's really interesting to me that he asks it this way. Has God said that ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? Well, no, he didn't. Actually, Eve's going to tell him, the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God hath said, Ye shall not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Just observation in the church, in the family. I don't typically feel like the sin that we commit, we don't know that it isn't sin. So the excuse, I didn't know that it was sin, I think is used less often than the other excuses. Eve knew so well that she was able to quote exactly what God said to her about eating of the tree. The serpent said unto the woman, Ye shall not surely die. Lie. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and truth, and ye shall be as gods. Truth, I think that's phraseology. God actually says at the end of the chapter that they became like us. Truth, knowing good and evil. Truth. So the serpent comes to Eve and presents a bold-faced lie, but then covers it with truth. The woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise. And she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her. And he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, just like he said they would be, and they knew that they were naked, and sewed fig leaves together, and made themselves aprons. Eve knew that it was a lie. Well, she knew what God had said, but then wanted to believe what the serpent said. And then she looked at the tree and started doing something that I think all of us do in our lives when we're faced with sin, okay, when we fail. She saw that the tree was good for food. It looked good for food. Lust of the flesh. I bet that's delicious. She saw that it was pleasing to look at. Lust of the eyes. And she saw that it was desired to make one wise. Pride of life. 1 John 2:16. Right? John writes all the things that are in the world, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, the pride of life, they're not of the Father. But they're tempting. The tree is desired to make one wise. I'm just going to make a caveat here and say the idea that we can learn something from a sin that we don't know yet, I need to experience this for myself, is a very dangerous trap. A personal experience or story. There's a show, and I'm not going to tell you what show, but the storyline to the show seems very, very interesting to me. I want to watch it, but I know that it's filled with inappropriate things. It would be sin for me to watch this show, but the story is so good. In fact, people tell me that the story is really good. It's a great story. You just got to watch it for the story. I mean, there's stuff in it, but you just got to watch it for the story. Man, I want to become wise to this story. I really want to watch it. I hear it looks great. It's a dangerous trap to fall into. And Eve falls into it. 1 Timothy 2:14. Can somebody read that for me? I'm just going to ask it. Was Adam deceived? Why did he eat the fruit? Adam wasn't deceived. So, was the fact that Eve was deceived an excuse that was acceptable to God? No. Was the fact that Adam was not deceived an excuse acceptable to God? No. Let's look at their reaction, or the way that they handled being approached with this sin. First of all, they hid from deity. They heard in verse 8, they heard the voice of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. Adam and his wife, they hid themselves from the presence of the Lord among the trees of the garden. And the Lord called unto Adam and said, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid myself. And he said, Who told thee that thou wast naked? Hast thou eaten of the tree whereof I commanded thee that thou shouldest not eat? And the man said, The woman thou gavest to be with me, She gave me of the tree, and I did eat. This is a really interesting response. See, when I've heard this verse, I always thought he was just blaming the woman. But then you think of it again, and really it sounds like he's blaming God and saying, the woman you gave me. I don't know if you've heard Eric Owens, but he explained it a little bit deeper than that. And he said, perhaps Adam was trying to save them in this situation. He says, the woman that you brought to me did it. So, can it be that bad? Right? You gave me this woman, and she made me do this. She gave me of the fruit. That's why I did it. Well, God said unto the woman said, the serpent beguiled me. Well, that's truth. She's speaking true there. In 1 Timothy, we know God does tell us that she was beguiled, that she was tricked. And then he punishes the serpent. I don't think there was an excuse for the serpent here. Somebody read 1 Corinthians 6:13. This is just a side point to Adam's reaction here.
Foods for the stomach and stomach for foods, but God will destroy both it and them.
So he's talking in this chapter of Corinthians, talking about sexual sin. And I believe they were saying here that because my body was made this way, right? My body food is for my body, and my body is for the food. Therefore, if I have these desires, right, they're natural to me, then how can it be wrong for me to do these things? When Adam says, this woman that you brought to me, that you made, did this thing, how can it be bad? Interesting point. Well, that's the part of the verse that I wanted. We have their response. They are punished. They are kicked out of the garden. They have their punishments laid out before them. But I think the burden now is on us to look at their reaction, how they fell to the sin, then how they reacted to being confronted with the sin, and then ask ourselves, how many of the excuses that they make do we make flippantly in our lives without even realizing or realizing that we're doing the same exact thing? How bad is this sin? You know the excuse just said earlier. It wasn't that bad. It's not as bad as another sin. It's a little white lie. It's not that bad. How inherently wrong is it to eat fruit? Really? Consider. Is it that bad to eat fruit? I think, and Matt did a great job of talking about sin itself. You need to understand that sin isn't bad because we feel it's inherently bad or that we feel like it hurts somebody or that it does. Sin is bad because it's transgression of God's law and it separates us from God. It doesn't matter what the thing is that we're doing. The question is it sin, and have we done it? Was it bad to eat? If God told us that it was wrong for us to eat mangoes, could we say, well, eating a mango isn't as bad as lying? Really? So, therefore, I can do it because it's not so bad. God actually answers that in the first 3 chapters of the Bible. It's not about how we feel the badness of the sin is. If Adam had taken charge in this moment as the husband with his responsibilities, I think this could have been avoided. Not to say man wouldn't have eventually sinned, but we see a downfall of man in not taking his responsibility. Now, with that as the groundwork of our first character, we'll say Adam and Eve, is our first character. We're going to jump over to 1 Kings. To set the stage, we will read 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 30. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. So, we are going to be studying Ahab and Jezebel shortly, another husband and wife combo. And Ahab is described very interestingly here, in fact, really harshly. Those that were before him, Jeroboam, his father, his grandfather, were so wicked. It says something similar of them. They did evil like none before them. They just progressively continue to get worse and worse. And we come to Ahab, and God says of Ahab, he did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. Now, turning over to chapter 21 of 1 Kings, we're going to see Elijah approaching him, but before this happens, Ahab has gone against God multiple times in 1 Kings. He disregards being approached about idolatry. In fact, Elijah takes 400 prophets, I think 900 prophets in total, and God annihilates them with fire. And it doesn't say anything about Ahab's response to that. In fact, Ahab comes to his wife Jezebel and says, "Look, can you believe this? Elijah just wiped out all of the prophets of Baal." And I almost see him it's an interesting read to see his reaction. And Jezebel threatens to kill Elijah, and he flees. Now, we don't see Ahab's response after that. All we saw is him excitedly coming to his wife about it, either upset or excitedly, and then Jezebel overrides everything and threatens to kill the prophet of God. Then after that, we come to this story. It came to pass that these things, Naboth, the Jezreelite, had a vineyard which was in Jezreel, hard by the place of Ahab, right next to his palace. Ahab spoke unto Naboth, saying, "Give me thy vineyard, that I may have it for a garden of herbs." So all of this is going to transpire because he wants a garden closer to his palace. Now, the reason why it is sin for Naboth to give this vineyard is because it goes against God's law in giving the land. There's a land promise, and he cannot give his land to the king. But is that really that bad of a sin to trespass? I mean, his life might be at stake here. Can't you just give up the land? Is it that big a deal? And what happens is he goes and pouts about it because he can't have it. Jezebel takes charge. She says, "Don't worry about it, hubby, I'll take care of it." She frames and murders Naboth, and then Ahab gets the vineyard. He gets up out of bed after moping about it and goes into the vineyard. So, we come to verse 25. But there was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. And he did very abominably, following idols, according to all the things, as did the Amorites, whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. I want to back up here and just notice that Elijah, in verse 20, finds Ahab, and what does Ahab say to him? "Hast thou found me, O mine enemy?" He has a really, really positive outlook toward the prophet of God. And he answered, "I have found thee, because thou hast sold thyself to work evil in the sight of the Lord. Behold, I will bring evil upon thee, and will take away thy posterity, and will cut off from Ahab him that pisseth against the wall, and him that is shut up and left in Israel, and will make thine house like the house of Jeroboam, destroyed. Now, verse 27, it came to pass when Ahab heard these words that he rent his clothes and put sackcloth upon his flesh. You guys remember Matt's class last week? The physical reaction to finding out you have sin in your life and that punishment is coming. He put sackcloth upon his flesh and fasted and lay in sackcloth and went softly. And the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, Because this is way worse than eating fruit, I'm going to punish him even worse than Adam and Eve. Because the sin is worse, right? Ahab's done, this isn't just eating a fruit that God condemned not to eat. This is idolatry. This is murder. This is stealing of land and property. So I am really going to punish Ahab now. Seest thou how Ahab humbleth himself before me? Because he humbleth himself before me, I will not bring the evil in his days, but in his son's days will I bring the evil upon his house. Now, the punishment was not completely averted here, but a really interesting response from God. You would think with the wickedness that was done here, the punishment would come swiftly. But what prevented God from bringing the destruction upon Ahab's household immediately? His humility. In this moment, Ahab humbled himself. Let's read one more time what God says. Seest thou how Ahab humbleth himself before me? Because he humbleth himself before me, I will not bring the evil in his days, but in his son's days will I bring the evil upon his house. How do we apply this? How do we reconcile, first of all, the fact that no matter the wickedness or no matter how small the sin, God will punish for it? And how do we reconcile the fact that if we humble ourselves and if others humble themselves, God will view that this way? Repentance without humility is nigh impossible, and we're going to notice that. Now, before we move on from Adam and Ahab, I just want to quickly notice some things that don't work when we realize sin is in our lives according to these men. We cannot say, I was tricked or ignorant. We can, but it's not going to prevent punishment. We can't say it wasn't that bad. Granted, I wrote all these down before you guys gave them to me. Just wanted to see that we were all on the same page. Covering the sin with good things. Hiding the sin. Well, that's not going to work. Can't hide from God. God made me this way. We touched on that point. Someone else is responsible for it. Well, my wife did it, or my husband did it. Attacking the messenger. Did it do Ahab any good, or Jezebel any good for that matter, to attack the messenger of God? No. Someone else's humility is not going to be any good for you. Reading God's punishment to Jezebel, I don't read anywhere in Scripture that Jezebel humbled herself, and the punishment came in her lifetime. It was pretty gruesome. What does the word humility mean? means to make oneself low, to lower yourself. And that has a lot of application. But thinking about today's society is interesting. Okay, we live currently in a society where, and this isn't necessarily the church, okay, but our society is based upon how people feel. It's a feeling-based society. So when you're faced with a question of, should I do this or should I not do this, typically the thought process goes something like this. Well, how do I feel about that? Well, I don't feel good about it, so I'm not going to do it. Or, I don't see anything wrong with it, so I am going to do it. It's feeling-based. That leaves no room for humility, okay? All that does is that makes you the standard of your morality. And that's, I believe, the problem with the world. There is no standard for morality anymore. And oh, definitely. And that's putting your opinion over an actual standard. So God has established a standard, and the world doesn't go to God's standard. The world goes to their own standard. How do I feel about it? Okay? And that's actually basically the opposite. That's elevating your opinion to the level of moral standard. That's the opposite of humility. We're becoming more religious, personally. They're just religious toward themselves. Yeah, that's a really great point. Jeremiah 13:15 through 18. We're going to read 2 Old Testament passages. Then we're going to read 2 New Testament passages. Somebody read Jeremiah 13:15 through 18. It's a little lengthy, but you can handle it. Mm-hmm.
Hear ye and give ear, be not proud, for the Lord hath spoken. Give glory to the Lord your God before he causes darkness, and before your feet stumble upon the dark mountains. And while you look for light, he turn it into the shadow of death, and make it gross darkness. But if you will not hear it, my soul shall weep in secret places for your pride, and mine eyes shall weep sore and run down with tears, because the Lord's flock is carried away captive. Say unto the king and to the queen, humble yourselves, sit down, for your principality shall come down, even the crown of your glory.
What is God's answer to the king and the queen to prevent God's carrying away of his people? Humility. In fact, it's going to be the answer to any time sin is in somebody's life. What is the answer? Humility. What does God want from us? Humility. Jonah comes to Nineveh, and after he is swallowed by the large fish and spit back up on the shore, the word of the Lord comes back to Jonah in chapter 3. And Jonah began to enter into the city, verse 4, a day's journey, and he cried and said, Yet 40 days, and Nineveh shall be overthrown. The shortest sermon, right? So the people of Nineveh believed God and proclaimed a fast and put on sackcloth, from the greatest of them even to the least of them. For the word of the king of Nineveh, the word came unto the king of Nineveh, and he arose from his throne, and he laid his robe from him, and covered him with sackcloth, and sat in ashes. And he caused it to be proclaimed and published through Nineveh by the decree of the king and his nobles, saying, Let neither man nor beast, herd nor flock, taste anything. Let them not feed nor drink water, but let man and beast be covered with sackcloth. They cried mightily unto God, yea, let them turn every one from his evil way and from the violence that is in his hand. These are not good people. This was a violent city. And God saw their works, that they turned from their evil way. Works of what? Works of humility. God repented of the evil that he had said that he would do unto them, and he did it not. As a congregation of God's people, we're going to I need to wrap this up, but we're going to have sin amongst ourselves. What's the answer to dealing with other people, maintaining unity, and helping each other deal with sin? Romans chapter 12, 1 through 3. And then I'm just going to say, read James chapter 4 sometimes for humility. But we're going to read Romans 12, 1 through 3 before we close. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that ye present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. And be not conformed to this world, but be ye transformed by the renewing of your mind, that ye may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly. When you don't have humility and you elevate yourself too high, that is not sober thinking. You're out of whack. You don't understand your level of importance, and you need to humble yourself. In James 4, he says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up. It's an upward battle. If you try, you're swimming upstream. If you're trying to elevate yourself, let yourself go downstream, and God will do the lifting. Thank you so much for your time.